Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, October 20th, where we have completed our first speech. Congratulations. And we are moving forward to preparing for our second speech. So, the first speech, as you know, was a 5-minute autobiographical speech that allowed you to practice many of the techniques that the textbook and I have been discussing in terms of presenting a speech. And now that we've had some experience doing that, I wanted to add a little bit more complexity. So, our second speech is an informative speech, and it is a 10-minute speech. So now we've got double the length of time. And in the informative speech, you basically are teaching the audience about something. Now, probably what you know best is your own biography, which is why your first speech was an autobiographical speech. You probably know the content of your life better than anything else. Now, that said, for the informative speech, you can talk about anything, but I usually suggest to students that they try to teach us something that they already have some prior knowledge of. So, that will save you some time. It could be something that you have learned or are learning about in a class. It could be something that you just happen to have an outside interest in. It could be also something that's related to your first speech that you wanted to expand upon. That said, you don't have to talk about something that you already have some prior knowledge of, but it will save you some time as you are getting ready for that informative speech. And what I'm going to do is to, much like I did with the first speech, is ask you to touch base with me one way or another so we can talk about how things are going with speech number 2. And you can see this in the notes below that what we will do next class is watch some sample informative speeches from students like yourself, but in no way affiliated with GCC. That might give you some ideas, even though today we'll talk about informative speeches as well. And we'll have our second quiz based on some of the material that was not covered in our first quiz. It will be similar to the first quiz, 20 questions, short answer, multiple choice, perhaps some true false. And again, I'm asking that you contact me for whether or not you wanted to interact with me via email or Zoom or phone or some combination thereof before speech number 2 is going to be due. And speech number 2, again, is a 10-minute informative speech. And you are also going to be using at least one audio or one visual. And that's something you might have elected to do with your first speech, but I didn't want you to have to be concerned with doing something like that. So today I'm going to talk about not only informative speeches, but also audio-visual materials. And finally, I'll even talk a little bit about supporting materials. You're not required to use outside resources for the second speech. But if it turns out that you do need to use outside resources for the second speech, the informative speech, I wanted you to have at least a little bit of background information. Your third speech, your final speech, will be a persuasive speech, probably the most difficult speech to deliver. It's why it's at the end, because not only do you have to provide information to the audience, but you have to also try to convince them to either accept the policy or to take action, or perhaps a combination of the two. And I've always said with the persuasive speech that the goal is not to persuade everyone. That's an impossibility. The goal is to earn their respect. So even though someone might disagree with you, they can still respect the fact that you were well prepared and that you presented a solid speech. And we'll talk a little bit more about the persuasive speech when we get a little bit closer to the persuasive speech. But you can begin to contemplate ideas now. You can certainly talk about those hot button topics, but you don't necessarily have to. It doesn't have to be that controversial. Think about something that's relatively non-controversial. For instance, improving diet, increasing exercise. Most people will agree with you, but the difficulty is not getting agreement. The difficulty is getting change in behavior. So again, we'll talk about this a little bit more with the persuasive speech. What I am thinking about with your first speech, though, your autobiographical speech, now that you have posted your speech, and what I am going to be doing is viewing those speeches and sending you feedback privately for those speeches. If we were meeting in person, you would have heard your peers deliver speech number 1. We're not meeting in person, but we are still going to hear your peers, because that is going to be today's attendance question. And today's attendance question is not going to be posted on Moodle. Today's attendance question is going to be directly sent to me via email, where I'm going to ask you to identify one strength and one weakness. That's all you have to do. One strength and one weakness of each of your peers' speeches. And what I'm going to do is to gather all of that information and to present that to you next class on our Moodle. So you'll be able to see what your peers thought of your speech as well as your classmates' speeches. Again, I'll organize all of that information. So do send me a strength and a weakness for each of your classmates' speeches. So just like I will be watching all of your speeches, you will be watching all of your speeches. And that said, I'm hopeful that doing that will give you also some possible ideas for what you might do or not do for speech number 2, the informative speech, where you are going to teach the audience something. This is chapter 12 in our textbook. Oh, and by the way, if you have not already sent me your outline for speech number 1, please do so, because remember that I am evaluating your outline as well as the speech. And we'll be doing something comparable with speech 2 and with speech 3. But if you did not send me your outline, I would have sent you an email asking you to please send me your outline, because I need to evaluate the outline along with your speech. So this informative speech, which is discussed in chapter 12, talks about some of the things that you could discuss in an informative speech. In my edition of the text, this is on page 196. You can talk about famous people. You can talk about places. How interesting it would be to learn about our own community, Greenfield, for instance. You could talk about things, events, ideas, procedures. Again, you've got 10 minutes to do it, which is not much. So you need to simplify. And remember that audience members and just listeners in general have notoriously poor listening skills and poor memory skills. So anything you can do to help us remember information. You can give us an explanation where you're telling us something. You could do a demonstration where you're showing something. You could do a combination of the two. But I do recommend, as you can see the notes below, that you limit your points. You have only 10 minutes, and again, there's only so much your audience can absorb. You use transitions or connections between your points. You avoid jargon, specialized language that's used in a particular discipline. So yes, you might be a nursing student, but you can't assume that your audience is made up of nursing students in this class, that you have to assume a general audience, so you can't use a lot of medical or technical terms, even though you and perhaps a few others in the audience might know. Unless you were speaking to a group of nursing students, then obviously you could use that technology. Cluster-like ideas, which is one of the memory techniques that we use, is that we group like ideas together. And think about how we work with telephone numbers, for instance. And this is called chunking, where usually we divide a telephone number into 2 pieces, the first 3 digits and then the following 4, where you are grouping like things together so that you are remembering fewer things, but they have more elements within the group. Associating new with old. And this is a teacher technique. Perhaps you've seen this in mathematics classes, for instance, where you talk about the old material and you scaffold on it, you build upon it to new material. Repetition. So repeating something helps an individual remember and helps an individual learn, which is why you will oftentimes hear repetition when somebody is trying to teach you something. Much more repetition than you might hear or you might see in, let's say, an academic paper where it's not necessary to use repetition. Addressing the different learning styles. We all learn differently. Some people learn orally, some people learn visually, and you've probably seen this in academic classrooms, even in an online classroom where I've provided you with text at the bottom of the video so that you can see my image, you can hear what it is I'm saying, but you can also read the important points. Obviously, schools prefer or schools, I should say, offer advantage to people whose strengths are in visual learning and in auditory learning. Less so with tactile learning, where you actually have to do something. But I suspect that you've already figured that out, having had many years of experience in school. and motivating your audience. Sometimes there's already motivation within the speech, but sometimes you've got to encourage your audience to think that what you're talking about has some relevance. Again, I think about teachers who basically have 16 weeks to try to convince you that the discipline that we're discussing, perhaps Shakespeare, has some applicability to your life, even though you are not going to be using Shakespeare in your day to day workplace. And of course, sometimes it's easier than others to try to motivate the audience. I always talk about timeless and universal concerns, that Shakespeare really is about interacting with people, and that's something that we have to do every day. So his stories about interacting with people help us interact with people ourselves in our daily lives. And just, of course, reading and writing in any form helps you with reading and writing in any context. And with our technological society, so much of what we do is reading and writing on computers. Whether we like it or not, that is the reality of it. I think I might have shared with you a speech that a student of mine gave in an attempt to be shocking. It was about the Heimlich maneuver, which is a pretty perhaps dry topic. It was an informative speech. What this student ended up doing, though, was simulating an actual choking. It was right towards the ending of the break where it sounded like there was a student choking in class. Another student ran up to the, quote, choking victim, unquote, and performed what appeared to be the Heimlich maneuver. Out popped from the victim's mouth a rolled ball of paper. The person who had performed the Heimlich maneuver calmly walked to the front of the stage and announced to us that what we had witnessed was a simulation of a choking. But if that had been real, would we have known what to do? And that the speech for that evening, because that it was that person's turn to give their speech after the break, the speech for that evening was about performing the Heimlich maneuver. So none of us knew that they had actually started the speech with this simulation, and that was what led to the brilliance of the motivating element within this speech, is that at first we didn't know it was a simulation. So of course we were very invested in the idea of, can we save this person's life? Do we need to save this person's life? So when we found out it was a simulation, much to our relief, then also we were also motivated probably to have a review on the Heimlich maneuver, which is probably something we had learned elsewhere, but in that split second, I'm sure all of us were thinking the same thing. Do I know what to do? Can I do what I need to do? Is this person going to die, and can I prevent that? So again, lots of things could have gone wrong. They had to plan it and execute it very carefully, which they did. The choking victim was a good friend of the person who was delivering the speech, so they had taken care of all of the details. But I always use that as an example of motivating audience. So I've heard many, many speeches over the years, informative speeches, and they've all addressed different things, whether they be about something that you're learning about in class that's of interest to you, whether they be how to do or make something. I've had lots of speeches creating meals and recipes. Those are not particularly easy things to do. If you've ever seen a cooking show, you've got to do a lot of planning ahead of time. And again, you've got to think about the timing of the thing. Because we are presenting on video rather than to a live audience, we're not going to be able to address audience questions the way that we normally would. So that's something also to consider, to try to anticipate audience questions, at least the obvious ones, and address them as much as you can to your ability, so that ultimately there would be few or no audience questions there. And of course, you've got to think about things like how visible are your props on camera. You would need to do that with a live audience as well, but now we've got the additional element of needing lighting and visuals. And keep in mind that your audio visuals should supplement, not replace you. We want to see your face. We want to interact with you. So I do remember hearing a speech, or watching a speech, I should say, that was recorded where the speaker was just a tiny little box, basically, and the rest of it was a PowerPoint presentation. And it should have been the other way around. The little box should have been the PowerPoint presentation, and we should have seen the speaker, because the speech was not about PowerPoint. The speech was about a speech that was delivered by a human being. So you've got to think about those things as well. You know, I remember a speech that actually fascinated the audience. It was a live speech where we were able to actually go and watch it occur in the GCC parking lot. And it was about how to change the oil in your car. And I remember I was just as fascinated as everybody else and had wished that instead of having to pay attention to evaluating the speech, I could have taken notes because this would have been very useful information to me. Another speech that I remember was very fascinating for the audience was given by a used car dealer. And he talked about the tricks of the trade, about how to basically negotiate price for a used car. Again, everybody was furiously taking notes. You know, I've seen speeches about playing musical instruments. I've seen speeches about historical events. So you've got a lot of latitude here with your informative speech. But I do ask that all of you touch base with me so that you can tell me what your informative speech is about. At the very least, to have an email communication with me. At the very most, you could even decide to perform your speech for me ahead of time so that I could give you feedback or something in between. So at any point now, you can begin contacting me for that practice session for speech number 2. So chapter 11 is on visual media. And there are lots of different ways that you could approach this. You can go low tech, where you've got something like a poster that's behind you, or you can go high tech, where you are utilizing something like PowerPoint. I'm not averse to PowerPoint. I think it serves its function, but I can say that when I say audiovisual, most people think PowerPoint, and that may not necessarily be the best way to communicate your message, especially remembering how PowerPoint can go bad. And you might have experienced this in your past, where the PowerPoint is invisible. So the font is too small, or it's the wrong color so that we can't see it, where the PowerPoint is not synced to the presentation. So that's another problem. So it's distracting, where the speaker is basically relying on PowerPoint to give the information rather than presenting the speech themselves. So there's lots of different ways that PowerPoint can go badly. Where there's too much text on the PowerPoint slides, it should just be keywords and phrases, because basically we want to see you give the speech. You can show pictures. Again, this is something to consider both live and on video. What is the size of the picture? What is the resolution of the picture? What is the best way to show this particular picture so that it is visible to the audience? Prompts, but also whether it be live or it be recorded, what props are appropriate, how visible is the prop, how do you interact with the prop. Audio video clips, those are other options. And again, whether live or filmed, how are you going to show that to your particular audience? And also think about balance, so that in a 10-minute speech, you don't want a 9-minute video clip. Perhaps if you were giving an hour speech, you could do a 9-minute video clip. I'd say no more than 2 or 3 minutes at most for a 10-minute speech. And audio is just as good as visual, so you can play something, for instance, music. If particularly your speech happened to be about music, that would make perfect sense. I don't know if you've ever heard of a flip chart. It really is what existed prior to PowerPoint. We would have these large sheets of paper on easels, and basically we would flip one page to the next. We would decide when to reveal the information, which is the beauty of PowerPoint. And I call it the pre-PowerPoint of what we had. Old school works just as well as new school, so that you could use a flip chart, but again, you have to think about visibility. If you're using Zoom, you have to think about the screen sharing options. You can use a whiteboard if you've got access to a whiteboard. There's lots of different ways you can go about doing your audio or your visual. But some suggestions. Always be professional. The days of just scrolling something on a piece of paper are over. We expect a certain level of professionalism. Always test your equipment beforehand. And that goes not just for live, but when you are recording. I always suggest that when you are recording that you've got a paper version of your handout, or a paper version of your outline, so that ultimately, if you were to have mechanical problems, you can at least rely on the paper version rather than relying on the screen version. Notice I mentioned handout. Handouts can work very nicely as well for audiovisuals, particularly if you want your audience to walk away with something, particularly if it's sensitive information, but or very complex information. But of course, we aren't presenting live, so you're offering us a handout would not be an option in this particular instance. Plan for a backup. You know, Murphy's Law, if something can go wrong, it will go wrong. Again, perhaps this is less of an issue if you're recording, because if something goes wrong, you can re-record. But again, the whole point of this is not your editing skills. Again, you don't want to splice together different pieces of different speeches. You want one take. I've seen students try to do that as well, where they're trying to come up with the perfect speech. Don't do that. There is no such thing as the perfect speech. And if this class is going to be useful for you, it's going to be useful in the context of the real world. In other words, when you have to present something via Zoom, or you don't have the time to splice together the perfect speech. You've got one take and one take only. And again, you want to do it to the best of your ability. Just like when you're presenting live, you've got one take and one take only, which is why ultimately practice is so important. Charts work very well for showing numbers. Pictures work very well for illustrating emotions. You want to be clear, you want to be simple, you want to be neat, you want to consider scale, balance, and proportion. Use color for interest, but don't overwhelm us with different colors. I've seen this on PowerPoint as well, or what I'm fond of saying, just because you can doesn't mean that you should. You shouldn't use every color option and every font option on your PowerPoint slide. It just becomes too distracting. Avoid all capital letters. Yes, you can capitalize an important word, but if you've ever had the unfortunate situation of having to read a paper written in all capitals, and I suspect every English teacher has, you'll see how difficult it is to be able to read that. And what studies have shown that if you want to make something stand out, bolding it makes it more visible than underlining it. Something for you to consider. Charts and graphs work very nicely, again, for numbers, because they can be very hard for us to conceptualize. So if you can show a visual, that can be very useful. So, supporting materials, Chapter 6. As I said, I wanted to briefly talk about this, though we'll talk about this some more as we get closer to our third speech, where you are required to use outside resources. And I suspect that many of you won't need to use outside resources for the informative speech if you're talking about something that you already have some knowledge of. But in the event that you do need to do some research for your informative speech, supporting material merely increases credibility and persuasiveness. One of the reasons why I'm requiring it for the persuasive speech. You do need to check for accuracy to make sure that you are providing correct information. And this is where I direct you to the GCC library resources. When I talk about audio visuals, if most people think PowerPoint initially, and again, I'm not averse to it, it just has to be done well. When I say supporting material, most people think internet, Google, or Wikipedia. And I'm not against Google, nor am I against Wikipedia, but understand that's a very simplistic way of finding information. Anybody can post anything on Google, on the internet. So we need to spend a lot of time trying to check for accuracy. And Wikipedia is like any other encyclopedia. It is the most basic of summaries. It's not original research. So if you are going to do something that is academic, you really want to work with resources that are much more sophisticated. And this is where I direct you to the GCC library. And not only do we have librarians that have vetted things and reviewed things like books and magazines and so forth, so that you know that if it's in an academic library, it's got a certain level of validity. And yes, you can still use paper like books and magazines. The library has databases, and those are electronic resources that you access through the internet, but they aren't available to the general public the way Google is. They are available only to subscriptions or to subscribers, and usually they're cost prohibitive for individuals to subscribe to. So usually organizations, for instance schools, for instance GCC. subscribe to these. And those are our databases, so that you as a student at GCC have access to these on any computer on campus or off campus, as long as you added in your GCC library code number. That would get you into the GCC databases. And the reason why the databases are so much more superior is that they have hired staffs of people to evaluate these electronic resources. That's not to say that mistakes can't be made. I'm always suspicious of everything, regardless of the number of people who've evaluated it. But certainly it's safer than something that you would find on the wide open net, because some people have gone through and tried to vet it. So I encourage you to use the databases. I'll never forget somebody who tried to make a comparison between being on the wide open internet and using a database. And what they talked about was that it was very similar to safe and unsafe sex. And that being on the internet is like unsafe sex. You probably will be okay, but there is risk. And using a database is like safe sex. That yes, there is the possibility of something going wrong, but the likelihood is much decreased. So I think of that, and whenever I think of using the wide open internet as opposed to the databases, perhaps that'll encourage you to access the resources that you've paid for really through your tuition dollars, our GCC library. Now, the good news about using outside sources, which we'll talk about in greater depth, is that it's much simpler to cite those sources than it would be in writing, because again, you have to think about being audience centered, adapting to the needs and expectations of the audience. Your audience is not going to want to be inundated with minutia, with things like place of publication and publisher. You should have access to that material in case you're asked by your audience. But ultimately, they are just going to want to know what information is yours and what information is not yours. So usually you can do this with what we call a tag, a verbal tag that you're indicating outside sources. Sometimes it could be as simple as according to studies, and then what you cite afterwards, the assumption is that this is not your original information. This is someone else's. Now, certainly you might be questioned, where did those studies come from? Who performed those studies? What were the dates? And you should be able to provide that information. But you don't have to be as precise when you are speaking as when you are writing. And that's just a general rule of thumb. Now, some of the things that we'll talk about further when we talk about supporting material, the kinds of supporting material you can have. You can have qualitative evidence. So these are anecdotes and stories. Or you can have quantitative evidence. These are facts and numbers and statistics. Both are useful. I would say that one is not necessarily better than another. Ideally, you would use both. I mean, just think about the idea of how do you determine whether or not GCC is a good school, let's say. Well, you've got the qualitative evidence, the anecdotes, the stories, but you've also have to look at the facts, things like graduation rates, for instance. But you know that also is flawed. Just only looking at graduation rates. So it's a combination of the two. I encourage you to use both whenever possible. And then whether you are relying on primary accounts, these are first-hand eyewitness accounts, or secondary accounts that are based on primary accounts, scholarship, for instance. And again, think about if you're doing research on, let's say, World War II. Ideally, you'd have a primary account, first-hand account. I don't know if there are even any soldiers alive who could offer you a first-hand account, but they experienced it, so they know. But we've got also secondary accounts that are based on their primary accounts and also based on scholarship. Because just because someone has experienced something, that doesn't mean that that's the only way to understand an event. They might be mistaken, they might be lying, they might be misremembering. There are any of a number of events that could be occurring. If nothing else, they see their piece but not the whole, which is why secondary pieces of evidence are so important. And ideally, you'd have a mixture of the two. When we get to the persuasive speech, I'm going to ask for just 3 outside resources. I'm going to ask that you include that in your speaking outline so that when I review your speaking outline, I can see what your sources were. I'm not going to be asking for them in any particular format, whether it be MLA or APA, and that ultimately I would want something that would be useful in the real world. In the real world, no one would look at your outline, but I want to look at it so I can give you some suggestions. In the real world, no one would probably demand to see your resources, but again, I would like to see your resources. I'm not particularly interested in what form you put them in, just so that I can give you my feedback. Again, hopefully you're using resources that have validity to them. But we'll talk more about this in our third speech. So where we are at this point is preparing for the informative speech. Next class, you'll have a quiz and you'll also be able to see some sample speeches. Hopefully that'll help you. At any point now, you can reach out to me to schedule some sort of a practice, whether it be very informal through email or something much more formal for what's happening with your second speech. Just getting, just touching base with me about your topic could be enough, depending on what your comfort level is. And your attendance question, which is where I leave you, should be answered via my email, as always. Should be answered via my email, which is not the way I usually do it. I usually do it on Moodle, but I would like to maintain a certain level of privacy for the attendance question. That'll be due on Saturday, the 22nd at 9 a.m. Certainly, if you need additional time, let me know. But I ask that you send this to my email so I can gather all of the information. Your job is to watch all of the speeches of your peers and to send me one strength and one weakness of each of those speeches so I can compile all of that and make that available for you next class. And again, you can find the student speeches in the top section of our Moodle page. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class preparing for the informative speech, speech number 2. Take care. Bye-bye.